Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome to another episode of the Comic Book Workshop. Today we are looking at the comic artist Juan Gimenez. Juan Gimenez is known for his collaboration with Alejandro Jodorowsky's for Meta Baron, which was a comic that Alejandro wrote, and then I think Juan did most of the art for it. I've actually never read Meta Baron. However, I have some art here that's from Juan's career overall, from a couple of different things that he's worked on. And I want to pick them apart and see what it is that we as comic artists can learn from Juan's work. And so we're going to be doing that today. We've got this really nice spot illustration. I guess it's not even a spot illustration. It looks like a cover illustration. And then we've got some comic pages with a couple of different things that I think we can learn and bring into our own work. My name is Wes. I'm a comic artist and an illustrator. And if you want to check out my comics or my art, you can actually go and check out the link in the description box below for my comics. So let's go ahead and get into it. So the first thing it is that I notice whenever I look at this piece, for one thing, the gesture is unbelievably beautiful, and it creates this kind of like motion throughout the image. I think it'll be easier if I drop this actually into grayscale. I drop this into grayscale, and then we have this figure here, right? There's a couple of different things that he's doing to create a very visually compelling image. And one of those is that he has this very strong diagonal line that is creating this break between the left side and the right side of the image, right? Now, there are other things that break the image up, but you could almost think of this image as being broken up into kind of a yin and yang sort of thing going on here, right? So if we look at the illustration back here in the background of the female, we can see that the more that I zoom in, the less I guess you could say concrete, or the less finished the lines are in this cloth that she's holding. Like we see some of the lines are here, but then there's no line here, and it looks like it kind of just fades into the background, right? And then we look at this figure here in the foreground, who's on the left of this very strong diagonal, and we see that everything is very much uh, accentuated, right? Everything is drawn in. All the details are drawn in of this character's armor, his hair, and it's very unlike the sides of this woman here, right? We look at her arm, for example, and if I zoom in really close here, it starts to be hard to tell the difference between the shading in the background and the shading for this cloth. But that's not the case with this armor, right? There's a clear distinction between where the armor is and then where the background image is, right? So there's a contrast between a number of different things. For one thing, there's the contrast of values. The woman in the background is painted with, I assume would be watercolor, but she's painted with a style the values are very close together and they're very faded, right? They have this kind of faded into the background, kind of a cloud kind of aesthetic to it. Whereas he is defined by very hard edges, right? So when it comes to painting and it comes to illustrating things, this is what we call edges, which is basically just how hard are these edges of these shapes. Are they very hard, like the armor here, or are they kind of amorphous and they kind of just churn into the background, kind of like with her jacket here, right? And so it creates this nice contrast of an image because with the lack of edges helps her have this kind of ghost-like appearance in the background, right? If she was drawn with the same sort of hard lines and edges as this figure here in the front, then we wouldn't really be able to differentiate, the foreground from the background, and it wouldn't feel as organized. But even here, you can see that he is using lines, but he uses them very strategically, right? So he doesn't use lines throughout the entire piece. We can see over here on this side that he doesn't really use any lines, but he wants to differentiate. He wants to create this hard edge of the cloth and this woman's face, right? And so he has this very hard edge here. But he balances it out by taking that hard edge away here, right? And I think the other thing too is what makes this image really nice is that you kind of have this kind of a thing going on, right? You could say that it's, or you could say it's something like this, right? Really beautiful image. A lot to be learned from looking at an image like this. Yeah, so I believe this is something from Meta Barons. Like I said, I'm not as familiar with it, but I am familiar with Alejandro Jodorowsky and his writings. And this feels very much like something Alejandro would think up. I really appreciate that, for one thing, Juan did everything traditionally, which is it's really impressive when you look at something like this because you realize how much time and effort had to go into making these illustrations and into making these paintings, right? We have this kind of biomechanical spaceship that's floating through space, and it looks partly like a monster and partly like a spaceship have kind of melded into one. And I imagine he probably uses gouache and watercolor for something like this, but something like this must take a whole lot of time, right? And then we have like traditionally set up scenes of just characters talking and narrating a scene. And we have a couple of different comic pages here that we can look at. But we can see the attention to detail is still prevalent here. We see that one is still, he being very particular about the kind of shots it is that he illustrates and where it is that he wants you to look, right? So we have, a couple of different things that are going on in a page like this. One of the first things that grabs my attention is this panel down here on the bottom. We have this contrast of color between this figure that's sitting here and then the rest of these figures that are sitting around here, which I think is pretty visually appealing. It's not only visually appealing, but it helps organize things a little bit better, right? We've got this obvious visual connection with this figure here being the captain, right? As he's making the orders, and then we have the figures responding to him. But overall, the composition of it it's also very beautiful. There's a composition that is leading your eye in this direction, and that is basically, in a sense, it's kind of blocking in this figure here, right? We have these different converging elements of the environment or the different figures that are kind of helping direct the flow of the eye in one general direction, right? You could even say that these are, in a sense, they're more pointing back this way, right? Again, we have the same sort of thing. We have these lines here, and then we have these very repetitive kind of shapes going on here, right? We have these sides of these spaceship compartments here, but notice that they follow the same kind of curvature as the heads, right? So there's these general kind of gestures to the overall illustrations for each one of these that is helping keep the illustration balanced and interesting visually to look at. Something like this is really interesting too. The first thing that pops out to me is the way that he sets up the panel layouts. We have this kind of full motion of a story that happens here on this one page. We have him being ejected as the plane is going down, and then he pulls his parachute. The parachute deploys, it catches him, and then he's basically holding his head saying, "Oh, my head," right? So there's a very straightforward narrative, but we have this kind of zigzag motion to the panels, which makes it interesting to look at. Now, some of the other things I think are very subtle, creative decisions it is that a lot of these artists make, and some of them is just the way it is that you set up a panel and the way it is that naturally leads to the next panel. So, for example, here in this first panel, I mean, well, first off, if I pull back and I look at this full page, it's really impressive to me that he was able to get so much illustrated onto this one page, right? Because there's a lot going on here. But he uses different techniques in order to organize the information. And clearly, he has the talent to know how much of something it is that he wants to show. But even a drawing like this, I mean, something like this would take the average artist quite a long time to illustrate. But there's a couple of different things that we can learn from it, and one of those is the way that he organizes his panels and how they lead one into the other in very subtle ways. So one of those is that we have this figure here who is holding the sword, and notice that we could break down this one panel right here in the composition in a couple of different ways. We have this sort of thing going on here. We have this figure who is holding this sword, and along with this wall edge here, we see that these two figures are kind of encapsulated within this frame here. And so you've got all three figures basically lined up right next to one another. And that is a very economical way to arrange something like this. But it also connects with the next panel because where is it pointing? It's pointing to the right, right? And when we look to the right, we see we've got this figure laying here on the ground that they're obviously going after. And I think it's interesting that his body as well is also aimed towards the right, right? Here we could say it reverses because we have this kind of shape here, this white shape that is again aimed towards the white, aimed towards the right. I mean, right? There's this kind of general motion to the right. Then we have these kind of close-up shots, which for one thing, I think it's interesting that he drops things into gray tone for story parts. But then you have, as we go down, we get these close-up on these two eyes, and then we pull back even further, and we see this group of figures here, and I assume this is this person right here. Um, but again, we have this organization principle, right? So you could say that this is kind of like a ladder. We go here and then we step, and our eye lands here because this is the person's eyes that we're looking at here. And what do we see? We get another one of these bordering elements where the sword is held at a specific angle that's keeping our eye from going to the left of the page. And then we look and see these soldiers, and they're talking about paying attention to a map, and they're all holding these swords. And notice that the gesture of the swords, this crossbow, even this javelin, they're all doing what? They're all pointing down at the last focal point of where we're supposed to look, which is the baby's head. Notice that all the detail over here is just secondary detail, right? So we have this kind of like this, and it's going down, right? So we kind of have another one of these, I guess you could say they're kind of a zigzag kind of thing going on here, that's pointing us down to the last image on the page. Now, the reason why it is that comic artists do this is because, for one thing, it's a principle of design because you're basically organizing. You have to organize all of this material onto one page, and it has to make sense not only in terms of having enough space to put the dialogue in, but it also has to make enough sense visually. It has to connect visually. So the first thing that comes to my mind when I look at images like this, such as this top image and this bottom image here, uh, what's interesting to me is that there's also this obvious subtext going on here that these gentlemen, these soldiers, could be looking for this child in order to kill them, right? The kid may be like a royal bloodline, and they're basically hunting down the bloodline in order to end the bloodline. So that's an example of some of the story techniques that Juan Gimenez uses in some of his illustrations and some of his comic stuff. I think I have one or two more images, but I'm actually going to go ahead and close this one for now. If you're interested in seeing more videos on comics, on my process for creating my own work, my podcasts where I interview independent artists, you can check it out all here on my YouTube channel. If you'd like to support what it is that I do, I have a Buy Me a Coffee donation button down in the link in the description. Feel free to drop a like, comment, let me know what you think, if there's any artists you'd like for me to look at next. And thank you guys. Take care.